Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. We have already looked at a wide range of UFO sightings reported this week from all over the world. But we will be focusing on a series of supposed sightings that happened in the Soviet Union. In these cases, the Soviet government was repeatedly forced to face and consider the possibility of extraterrestrial enemies of the state. Yeah, it shouldn't be too surprising that most high-profile UFO sightings are said to have happened in the United States. The country is so big and has so many local and national media outlets that there doesn't seem to be a limit to how people who have seen strange things can tell others about them, no matter how often they are laughed at. Kenneth Arnold came up with the term flying saucer after he saw several unidentified flying objects in 1947. Since then, North America has had what seems to be an endless number of alleged UFO sightings. From the supposed crash of an alien spaceship in Roswell, New Mexico, to the recent video recordings of unknown high-speed flying vehicles by US Navy pilots, there has been a wide range of these stories. In the past, these kinds of cases have often led the media to ask the US government questions that were not welcome. In some cases, the military has been used, and officials have been brought in front of the cameras to explain something. However, the same level of reporting is not found in countries that are the same size or even bigger. This makes me wonder what it is about the United States that extraterrestrials love so much. For example, there don't seem to be many stories like this from the Eastern Hemisphere, either now or when the Soviet Union was around. A quick search on the internet shows that there is no clear evidence that any member of the Soviet government has taken an official stance on the possibility of alien visitors. And yet, more and more stories are coming to light that suggest the country's leaders have met with strange visitors more than once. In February 1985, two train drivers named Orlov and Mironov took 70 empty freight containers to a refinery in the town of Kostyum in the northwest of the country to get iron ore. Picture the trip they had taken was a common one. It took them all the way across the empty, open space of the Caribbean territories, and it was usually a boring trip. The two men were passing the time in the car's cabin when they saw something that looked like a large ball of light moving parallel to the train tracks, just above a nearby tree line. As they watched, the glowing sphere suddenly sped up and began to move along the tracks directly in front of the train. They screamed and grabbed the engine's brakes, afraid that a train would hit it. If anything, it seemed to be going faster now, as if the thing in front of them was pulling them along in some way. Mironov couldn't slow down the locomotive, so he used the radio to call in a panic to the staff at the Novopesky train station, which they were quickly approaching at a high speed. The woman who answered the phone couldn't understand what the scared driver was trying to say, but she was startled by the sound of shouting from the platform right outside her office. As she ran out of the room, she and a small group of staff and passengers saw a glowing object about 13 feet across speeding down the tracks toward them, right in front of the train. But right before it got to the platforms, this strange craft took a sharp turn to the side and disappeared. This left the fast locomotive to speed through the station with no brakes and no working engine. Moments later, when the train was fully away from the platforms, Mironov and everyone else felt it start to slow down. However, their joy was quickly taken away when the object suddenly veered ahead of them. Again, the train slowly started to move forward, even though the brakes were still on and the engines were off. It seemed to be dragged along at a high speed by the silent and moving craft. This strange event would go on for another hour, during which the train would travel more than 30 miles behind the glowing object. After that, the object would disappear again, but this time for good. When the train finally stopped, the two engineers were surprised to find that they had saved more than 300 kilograms of fuel because of this strange thing. Also, the unknown craft was pulling things behind it that hit the train's windshield and front bodywork as they went by. But there was no physical evidence of the mysterious object anywhere. 4 years later, on the other side of the huge and sprawling Soviet territories, one of the most famous UFO sightings in Russian history is said to have happened in the industrial city of Voronezh. On September 28, 1989, strange stories started to appear in state media in the morning. Over time, it became clear that something had happened the night before in one of the city's central parks and that a large number of people had seen it. It's about 6:30 in the evening. That night, people walking and playing in Level nearly Senior Park suddenly noticed a strange glowing shape hovering low in the sky above them. All of the descriptions of this strange ship seemed to agree that it was about 45 feet in diameter and 18 feet tall, with a metal surface that seemed to be giving off a dull red glow. At the same time, more and more people started to gather in the park. They watched in amazement as the strange ship began to slowly descend to the ground. As it did so, metal legs unfolded from inside its lower section, and it landed near where a group of teenage boys were playing football after school. Another 40 people who had been waiting at a nearby bus stop joined the crowd of onlookers, bringing the total number of people watching to over 100. On the bottom of the thing, a hatch opened. Moments later, a 9-foot-tall, stocky being came out. It was wearing some kind of silver jumpsuit and bronze-colored boots. When compared to the rest of its body, the creature's head was very small. It had two large, almond-shaped eyes on either side of its face and a third, smaller eye in the middle that seemed to move back and forth as it scanned the area and did whatever kind of evaluation it was doing. The ship's occupant was then joined by two more identical figures. All three wore plates that looked like discs and were attached to the front of their suits. From inside the ship, a much smaller box-shaped building appeared. Behind the three of them, it started to move along the ground in a way that looked like it was done by a robot. This machine would sometimes stop and reach down to the ground, where it seemed to take soil and grass samples as directed by the three taller figures walking in front of it. When this happened, panic spread through the crowd of people watching, and some of the younger people screamed in fear. From this point on, the stories about what happened start to be a little different. Several of the witnesses later said that the craft and its people suddenly vanished from sight, only to reappear a few minutes later at the same spot where they had left. Others said that one of the beings pulled out a thick metal tube about a foot long and pointed it right at one of the crying teens. The young man in question seemed to disappear under the power of whatever invisible beam this device was making. He reappeared a few minutes later, after the creatures and their craft had left. Several soldiers and police officers were there to see what happened. Later, it was reported in the local news that city officials thought the situation was important enough to warrant a formal investigation. Several trees were said to have been broken or bent backwards because they were in the path of the descending craft. Investigators also found higher levels of background radiation than should have been there, as well as traces of a strange mineral deposit that had never been found anywhere else on Earth. In the months that followed, there were more reports of flying craft and strange creatures in the sky above Voronezh. These reports were later written off as mass hysteria, though. Even today, a lot of people in the city insist that the people who came to visit them on that fateful autumn evening were real and could not have been from this world based on how they looked. However, as scary as the first two events were for the people who saw them, the most disturbing story ever to come out of this part of the world was said to have happened in a remote part of Siberia in the winter of 1993. After the Soviet Union fell, the CIA later made public a 250-page report on intelligence that went into detail about this event. It was about a nightmare fight between Russian soldiers and an alien ship that happened somewhere in the vast Siberian wilderness. The fight is said to have started when a group of infantrymen from one of the nearby garrisons went out on a training exercise. They had noticed an unidentified object hovering over a beautiful, secluded, and remote wooded area, and decided right away that it was dangerous. Several of the men used a surface-to-air missile launcher to shoot down the plane right away. The plane then spun out of control for a few seconds before crashing into a nearby clearing. As the army unit spread out to surround the fallen object and take control of it, 5 creatures had come out of it to meet them. They were described as being short and stumpy, but with big black eyes. As 2 Russian soldiers walked up to the creatures with their guns drawn and told them to give up, the creatures ran away. Instead, one of the things had shot at them with an unknown weapon. Moments later, the 2 soldiers turned into living statues made of a rock or hard mineral that no one knew what it was. The 5 groups then started shooting at the other troops who were surrounding them without any thought. Only 2 of the Russian soldiers who were there were able to get away before they were killed. All of their other friends were killed in the same horrifying way. When a much bigger group from the garrison came back to the scene later with the survivors and help from an armored vehicle and a helicopter, they found that the ship and its people were gone. But the frozen bodies of 23 of their fellow soldiers were still strewn around the empty clearing, where they had turned into grotesque mineral shapes. They used to be. The long briefing document also says that soon after, the KGB got involved. The event was covered up quietly, and the bodies of the soldiers who died were sent to a lab in Moscow. Scientists who looked at the bodies couldn't figure out what exactly had been used to bury the dead soldiers, which made it hard for them to do a detailed study. All that could be said for sure was that it seemed to be from another planet and had a chemical structure that was similar to limestone from Earth. One thing that sets these reports from the Eastern Hemisphere apart from the many that have come out of the United States is that each of them involves a large number of witnesses. In the United States, on the other hand, most sightings have been reported by groups of 2 or 3 people. Most of the time, there was a large number of people involved in the stories that came out of Russia. This made it hard for the government to ignore or cover up. And, if by chance, the sheer number of people who saw something has in some way led to these stories getting out from behind the Soviet veil of secrecy and being shared with the rest of the world. It raises some questions that could be troubling if, like in the US, there have been a lot of other incidents where only a few people saw what happened. What did the Soviet government do with the people's stories and the stories of those who were affected? Are there still a lot of stories to be told that lend even more support to the idea that aliens have visited our planet? The full truth of the matter is still a bedtime story that hasn't been told.